Good morning. March session at Antaiji ended yesterday. Today, March 6th. We still have quite an amount of snow here, so the road isn't open yet, but hopefully in 2 weeks or so cars can get up here again. Usually at Antaiji during the winter, apart from the Zen, we spend our time studying, and we have a Dharma talk every day. These Dharma talks are not given by me, but the other practitioners take turns talking. This year the topic of the Dharma talks was the Dhammapada. Often we talk about texts by Dogen. So in the past we studied the Tenzo Kyokun or the Chijishingi during the winter, but this time we decided to study an older text, the Dhammapada. And I participate in these Dharma talks only as a listener, and then at the end in the discussion that follows the talks. But every month before the session I give Teisho, and right now I'm talking about the Shobogenzo chapter Gyoji, ceaseless practice. Last month was the section that deals with the second patriarch, Mahakasyapa in India. Dogen calls him the 8th patriarch because he also counts the 6 Buddhas that came before Shakyamuni. And Mahakasyapa is usually famed for being among the disciples of Shakyamuni the one who did the most rigorous practice. This practice is called Dutta in Sanskrit and Sudha in Japanese. And in the Gyoji chapter, Dogen Zenji explains about this practice. Part of that is that you are not supposed to lodge in monasteries. You don't stay in monasteries, but you're supposed to lodge on a mountain. And later it says, well, you should stay under a tree in the open on a field, for example. But then in a different section it says, you should sleep not under a tree, but in the open. So obviously these different aspects, they kind of contradict themselves. Another of these points says you're not supposed to sleep at all. If you become sleepy, either do zazen or do kinhin. Don't lie down in the first place. And then one of these points says, well, you should stay in cemeteries and spend your time looking at corpses and skulls. That's a practice that I heard from people is still been done by some Theravada bhikkhus. For example, I heard of people who participated in this practice in Thailand, where they meditate in front of a corpse over the course of several days and weeks, and then they actually witness how this corpse that initially it could be still a young lady, maybe beautiful, but then the corpse swells up. There's gas building up inside under the skin and coming out, liquid coming out, the skin falling apart, the flesh becoming visible. There's insects, maybe other animals feeding on that flesh. Eventually the flesh falls off, the bones become visible until it turns into a skeleton. In a tropical climate, I could imagine that process, well, it will take several weeks, but it doesn't take really years until the bones become visible. Obviously in Japan, you don't handle corpses like that. It's well, it's probably pretty much the same in the West. When somebody dies, you have to first get a doctor to say that they're actually dead. You have to prove that they're dead. And then usually in Japan they're cremated, so you don't leave corpses like that, like you could find maybe in India even today, that there's a corpse by the street or so. You don't do that anymore, but with animals, for example, there's dead pigs, wild pigs, boars that you sometimes find in the mountains around Antaiji, and actually it doesn't take so long until they actually turn into white bones because of the climate, humidity, other animals feeding on them. It doesn't take a year or so for a boar to decompose. But that's something that usually we don't have the chance to witness, especially in the West. For example, when I was 7 years old, my mother died and I asked to be at the funeral. But that time my relatives told me, well, boy, you're still so young, it's too early for you to attend a funeral. And at the time I was kind of angry that I was told you're too small, you're too small to be at the funeral. But for the adults it seemed to be kind of normal that why should we take a kid to a funeral? It's nothing for kids to be there. So actually I never attended a funeral, and when I was still in Germany I know from movies also how funerals are done in the West, but the first time I attended the funeral was 13 years ago when my teacher died in Antalya. I attended that funeral, and after that there was my wife's grandmother that died, and I was asked, as I was a Buddhist priest, the relatives of my wife, my wife's part of the family, asked me to do the funeral. It was my second funeral that I was attending. First time I was in charge. And then a couple of weeks ago, the mother, 100-year-old mother of one of my Dharma brothers, a very senior Dharma brother, he's also around 70 already, he asked me to perform a funeral for his mother, although he is himself a priest, but he said, well, it's my mother-in-law, I can't do the funeral myself, you do it. These 3 funerals are the only funerals I attended, all of them in Japan, and what I found interesting about it, or what is very different from how you do it in the West, is that although Japanese, they try to avoid to even mention death usually in normal life. Maybe we're pretty much the same in the West, although at the wedding ceremony, for example, there's this famous phrase, until death do us part. So you mention, you're aware of the fact that when you marry, one point you will die and you will part. That's something that Japanese couldn't even think of to mention. You don't mention that at a wedding ceremony. And some Japanese are afraid of the number 4 because 4 is pronounced sometimes shi in Japanese, and shi also means death. So many hotels in Japan, they don't have a room number 4. Some buildings don't even have a 4th floor because people are afraid that might be a bad omen to live in that room or on that floor. But then when it comes to an actual funeral, I have the feeling that Japanese connects much closer to death than we do in the West. So the first thing you do on the night the person has died, you spend that night with the person, what in the West we would call a wake. And the priest in charge, so that was me a couple of weeks ago, you read the last sermon of the Buddha. Basically that's what in the Shobogenzo would be the Hachidai Ningaku. That's from the last sermon of the Buddha, you read that. And after that the close relatives spend the night in the same room. Sometimes they even sleep close to the dead person. Then the next morning is the actual funeral service, which is more or less like a jukai ceremony, a precept ceremony. You give the precepts to the deceased person, hoping that, well, the person is still there in some sense. Otherwise, well, what sense would it make to give the precepts to that person? The person gets Dharma name at that point. And then everybody goes to the crematory. And there's another short chant, because before that person is brought to the oven, pushed into the oven, everybody witnesses how that person goes into the oven. And then it takes an hour or 2 for the corpse to be burnt. And for some reason that always happens around noon. So this time in between is used for people to have lunch. People have lunch, and after lunch the corpse is burned, it comes out of the stove. And at that point again, the relatives are there. And I don't think it's done that in the West, but in Japan, you adjust the temperatures to a point that so that all of the flesh, the skin, the flesh is all burned off the bones, but the bones are still there. So it looks almost like a skeleton. So you can still see where the head was, the bones, the arms, the legs, the pelvis. It's all there. And what you do then is, in Japanese it's called honehiroi, collecting the bones. The relatives pick up the bones with chopsticks. Or actually a person that works at the crematory picks up the bones, and often he explains, well, this bone is from the pelvis and this is kind of the throat and this is this. And then he hands it with his chopsticks to one of the relatives that picks it up with a chopstick. And then you take turns and the next person picks up. That's a reason why when you're invited to a Japanese home, to a meal, and somebody offers you food with chopsticks, you should never pick it up with the chopsticks, because people would connect that to this custom at the funeral. So whenever you're invited to a meal in Japan, never pick up food from somebody else's chopsticks, because that is what you do with the bones at the funeral. So what is kind of amazing about this custom is that for one, you, in the process of 1 hour, and during that time you have lunch, you see this change from a dead body that still looks like as if the person was still only sleeping, turns into a skeleton, and then you pick up the bones with your own hands and fill them in that container, where they don't fit all of them in, but you try to fit them as much in as possible, kind of squeeze, and in the end they crack, and then you take this back home and eventually they go to the grave. Something that probably wouldn't be kind of even thinkable to do in the West, but I think it's a good way to relate to death. I think about 13 years ago there was this case of the, I think it's called Tri-State Crematory in Georgia, where there was a crematory. For some reason the owner of the crematory didn't burn several hundred of corpses that he was supposed to burn and turn into ashes. He just dumped them somewhere on his grounds, and after decades, people that were walking their dogs, they found